Hello, this video is about looking at unseen poetry, and it's designed to help build students' confidence at writing about poems for the first time. Now, before we look at a poem, we're going to look at some problem areas related to unseen poetry. Now, one of the first things is that students often rush to write something down. And lots of things in English, you really do need to think before you write anything down. And so we want you to do some thinking before you start writing about any poet. And don't write the first thing that comes to mind, because often that isn't the right thing, or it could be the most obvious thing. And the most obvious thing doesn't really get you the high marks. And the second thing is lots of students try to spot every single technique. And actually that's quite an easy skill to do, but it's not what the examiner's looking for. The examiner's not looking for you to mention every single technique. What the examiner wants you to do is talk about the ideas in the poem and link it to a few techniques. So we see that a lot of students, when they first get given the poem, is they try and spot every single technique. And often that's quite a dangerous thing, because it means that you're not thinking about the ideas in the poem. And because of that spotting techniques, we end up with students who try to mention every technique. And when you're trying to mention every technique in the poem or language feature, that means that you're not really explaining the ideas in the poem or what the writer's trying to do. And this links into the first thing that we put on here, is that not thinking or planning a response. You need to plan a response for most things in English, and if you don't, then what happens is you tend to ramble and you tend to say points that aren't really developed. And the key thing in English is explanation. What gets you the higher marks is not the amount of points, but your explanation and how developed and detailed that is. And that comes with your planning, and your planning helps you to get that developed explanation. When you see the poem for the first time, it can be a little bit daunting, but remember, with unseen poetry, no other student has seen this as well. So the examiner's looking to see what you come up with on your own. So they know that the teacher hasn't prepared you with this exact poem. So that's what the examiner wants to see, what ideas you come up with. So the danger is that sometimes you zoom in on the question. And actually, I'd say make sure you read the poem first before you focus on the question. Because sometimes when we read the question, what we then do is look at the text looking for stuff with the question. I think it's really important to read the poem, make sure that you understand and think about it. So here we go. Considering the Snail by Tom Gunn. The snail pushes through a green night, for the grass is heavy with water and meets over the bright path he makes, where rain has darkened the earth's dark. He moves in a wood of desire, pale antlers barely stirring as he hunts. I cannot tell what power is at work, drenched there with purpose, knowing nothing. What is a snail's fury? All, I think, is that if later I parted the blades above the tunnel and saw the thin trail of broken white across litter, I would never have imagined the slow passion to that deliberate progress. So once you've read the poem, it's then best to look at the question and then think, what is the focus? Now with the question, it tends to be the same sort of pattern with the question. How does the poet present? And that word present means show, and usually that's linked to methods. So how does the poet show us the snail? And so we've got our focus. Okay, so once you've got the focus, then you can start being a little bit specific about it. Now generally, the number 3 is a good thing to think about when looking at unseen poetry. And what we suggest you do is look at the poem and see if you can pick out 3 images in the poem. So for me, I'm going to pick out 3 images, and I'm going to pick out this first one, which is the snail pushes through a green night. And then my second image is I'm going to have this pale antlers linking into that and the hunt there. So that's my second image. And then I'm going to look at this little thing at the bottom, and I'm going to pick another image, and I'm going to kind of think about this idea of the parted the blades. So I've got 3 images in the poem, and I'll just highlight that on the poem so you can see where I've taken it from. So I've got this one here, this image, I've got this image here, and then I've got this image here. So when you've picked out your 3 key images from the poem, and then it really helps you to narrow and focus and think about what we're saying with the question is, how does the poet present the snail? We've now got 3 images, and actually when you're writing about the poem, you can, if you're not sure, refer to just the images in the poem, but that is your technical term. Obviously we're going to look at other things in more detail, but it does help you to explain when talking about poetry, because that's what poetry does. It uses lots of images to try and get some ideas and some messages across to the reader. So here we've got 3 interesting images. So if we look at the first one, so the snail pushes through a green night. Now, very simple. We've not got any additional detail about the snail. We've just called it the snail, haven't we? And the poet has. But I think this idea of pushes through really gives us a sense of this idea of something small and something kind of challenging, trying to fight their way around. It gives that sense of kind of like this challenge that we've got. And because we know snails are very, very small, we can see that sense of kind of like sympathy. And that's what we kind of expect snails to be, very, very small and tiny. Yet when we get to the second image, this idea of antlers. Now, when we tend to think of antlers, we tend to think of like stags, and this idea of animals, bigger animals. So in this second image, we've got this idea of this tiny little thing hunting. And so we've kind of inverted and changed that original image that we've got in that first one. And you see when you pick images apart and look at them like this, you can see some interesting connections or changes across the poem. And then right at the end, we've got this, I parted the blades above the tunnel. Now, it doesn't directly relate to the actual snail itself, but I think it does show us the environment in which the snail is in, this idea that of danger. And if we think about blades, we think of death, and we've got some interesting ideas about this snail in the poem. So when we look at these images, we can start building up some ideas. Now, the examiner is looking for AO1 ideas addressing the question. So, unusually, when we're talking about unseen poetry, we're looking to make 2 or 3 ideas about the poem. So, what we could say that in the poem is this idea of 3 separate things that we see in the poem. So we can start thinking about what words we could use. So thinking about that question, how does the poet present the snail? Well, if we look at that first image, we can see how actually it's kind of like very, very determined. And actually it's fighting against the odds. And if we have a look in the poem, we can see this idea of pushing through, and we can explore that idea of that verb pushing, that it's not kind of like hiding or anything. It's quite an active verb of what the snail is doing. It's not hiding. It is determined. It's doing what it wants to do, and it's got a purpose. And we can see that through that choice of the verb. And then we've got this idea of the pale antlers. So we've got this idea that maybe that it's got a hidden strength, this creature. And what we think is something tiny and small has actually got something greater about it. And the fact that it's hunting, and actually what we've got kind of there, hunting is quite an aggressive verb. To hunt is to kill. And so could this creature be wanting to kill things? Or, as suggested in the poem, that it's got the woods of desire. So is it hunting for a mate? And this idea of antlers, and what happens with stag is they fight each other to get the mate. So is this suddenly, when this snail is mating and ready to mate, it gets quite aggressive, and it's got that hidden strength. So most of the time it's quite hidden. Okay, but also we've got that third image about the blades above the tunnel. Okay, and that this idea is willing to, in a way, sacrifice itself. This going through this dangerous, and obviously we talked about blades and death. So is this snail willing to sacrifice itself for love or to find a mate? And so you can see how we've got the formation of a plan there. So we've got our images, we've got our ideas, and then we can link those now to the choices that we've got and then explore them further. So if I just change the highlighter, you can see, as we've got here, what shows that he's determined, or the fact that he pushes through. But we can also link that to the blades of the tunnel, so the grass, this idea that the dangerous environment. We talked about the hidden strength, and the idea the verb hunts is not a word that we associate with snails. And so we can see that has that hidden strength. And this idea of the antlers, willing to defend itself. And as we talked about this willing to sacrifice itself, we've got those ideas there. So you can see how you can build up a paragraph by taking an image, looking at that image on its own, and then thinking of some ideas. And that's how we can build up a paragraph in our writing. So what's the next steps with this then? Well, obviously this is one poem. So the next step is to practice this skill with other poems. And there's two websites here we recommend, which has got a range of poems which you can easily do. You've got Poetry by Heart, which is aimed at young people and has a range of different poems. And it has lots of poems that kind of thematically were the kind of things that come up in the exam paper itself. But also there's the Poetry Foundation, which has a big bank of lots of poems. And what we suggest you do is just get into the habit of reading a poem and practicing that idea of picking out 3 images and thinking about what does it show us about that topic or that idea. Now we just talked about animals, but it could be about a number of things. It could be a relationship, it can be an idea, it could be a concept like getting old or getting married. So it could be absolutely anything. But read the poem, pick out 3 images, and think about what is the poet saying, and then can you spot any techniques that the poet is using to get that message across. Do have a look at the YouTube channel to see the other videos that's related to this, and we'll be adding more as we go along. Thank you.